Okay, welcome everybody to the June 11th Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. On today's agenda, which is located on the Climate Council website, we will have a review and approval of the agenda today. We'll do some guest introductions. We're not doing our in-depth introductions anymore, but we'll just introduce guests that are here with us just for today. We'll move on to subcommittee liaison and member updates for a few minutes. Then we will dive into the meat of the meeting today and follow up on some of the tasks in the work plan, specifically talking with Joe and team on the policy and program inventory task group on tasks 1 and 2. In the work plan. We also have Matt Pritchard here from Vermont Emergency Management Homeland Security Unit to talk with us about critical infrastructure in Vermont and what the Vermont Infrastructure Protection and Resilience Plan defines as critical infrastructure. And we really need to come to a consensus position on definition of critical infrastructure, just so that we are all on the same page. There's lots of interpretations out there. And then we'll open up for public comment and adjourn by 2:30. Are there any changes to the agenda that are needed? And the minutes are all linked in the agenda as well. Nope. Okay. So I just mentioned that we have Matt Pritchard here from the Homeland Security Unit at Vermont Emergency Management. So he'll come on video in a minute. There he is. And so he'll be talking a little bit later. And we also have Marissa Yanez from, she is our new hazard mitigation intern at Vermont Emergency Management, and she's joining us today just to listen in. Hi, Marissa. And do we have any other folks that are here as guests just for this meeting? Doesn't look like it. Okay. So, subcommittee liaison and member updates. We have Jay and Chad from our other two subcommittees. So you two can decide who gets to go first, and then we can open it up to more general updates. Jay
go for it, Jay. Either way.
I'll go first. So we met on Wednesday, and there were two main areas of discussion, identifying task leads for the different working areas, and then number two, discussion around the Stockholm modeling and projections, looking at all the different inventories around how energy usage in buildings and transportation. And there was a lively discussion around modeling there, and it was really informative. The one area, the crossover area that in one of the tasks that Leslie Ann and myself are working on with the climate projections, the Vermont climate assessment, which is coming out relatively soon, is mostly backward looking. And so Leslie Ann and I, wearing our professional training hats, are gonna put a framework around that on forward looking, how we're gonna actually model the next 30 years of climate and understand where all the risks are. So we were wondering if there might be one person from this committee who might want to work with Leslie Ann and myself, especially around some of the rural resiliency index work. And I could bring some of that work to this group, or if there was one person that was a clear lead on that might want to work with us too. That was kind of our only clear ask there.
So just to recap, you're looking for somebody who could help inform really the identification of different types of data that would go into modeling what climate impacts would be for the future.
Yeah, and I think trying to tie in the projections, because most of this is going to be backward looking, but tie in some of the projections work to the resilience tool that's being worked on mostly through this committee, right? Just to connect the dots more than anything else.
Yeah, and just to clarify, Jay, it's a vulnerability index. It's not a resilience index.
Sorry,
so
my apologies. Yes.
It's just we want to they can be over, there's some overlap, but they mean, different things, obviously.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's not lost on me. Trust me. I apologize for that. Chris, you had a question?
Yeah, just what's your time frame? I mean, when do you need help? The reason I'm asking is we have somebody coming on in mid-July who's got some expertise in this area. She may be able to help you, but I don't know if that's too late.
Leslie Ann we're just trying to develop a framework for this. Like, how are we going to actually tackle the projection stuff by mid-July? We're not going to do the work by then.
Okay.
So it sounds like similar time frame, Chris.
Great. Well, she's not here, so I'm going to volunteer her. So,
Well, I'd also be happy to be involved in the interim between now and the middle of July. Is great timing for me, Jay.
Okay. Well,
So this is Jens Hilke at Fish and Wildlife.
All right. So Jens, you're it for now then.
And Chris, who do you have coming on, just so we can?
Her name is Bronwyn Cook, and we've had this work in our work plan. We've just been, I apologize, sidetracked by the legislative session. She's serves as the sustainability planner in the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts for, like, I don't know, 11, 12 years. So she's got great expertise in all of this stuff. So, but wish she could get here sooner, but she starts July 12th.
Great. Okay, so I hear Jens and, go ahead, Jane.
You should finish up this. I just wanted to highlight one more thing from the science and data meeting.
Yeah, so I think that's great. And I think that'll really benefit us when we get into the municipal vulnerability index and having some more targeted discussions around that. Catherine and I have really decided to try and prioritize our climate action plan recommendations in the plan development for the summer, and then we would probably revisit the data needs and feeds for the municipal vulnerability index. It is going to take some targeted thinking from this group to really identify what equals vulnerability and what data supports that, so that we can show that and model that at the municipal level. Jane, did you? I
just thought I would encourage people. Jay mentioned this, but the modeling from the SCI Institute, what that is the business as usual reference case. And so that model takes a look at what would happen to our emissions with current policies in place. So, like, if we didn't actually do anything with the climate action plan, what's the model project would happen with our emissions between now and 2050? And I think for many people, it was actually quite surprising how and was challenged by the assumptions that went in, because it actually shows that our emissions will go drastically down on their own with current policies in place. And so there was a lot of good discussion around why that was like that and why it might not actually be the case. And so especially this was presented at both science and data and cross-sector this week. And I would encourage that the science and data was a longer, more detailed presentation than cross-sector. So if anybody's interested in seeing that, it's up now, the recording of that, and you can just sort of fast forward to the presentation component of the SCI work. But SCI will be enabling, that work will be enabling the technical analyses that we now are going to undertake for the climate action plan. So it's a good starting point for folks if you're interested.
Great. Thanks, Jay. Chad, do you want to provide your liaison update?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. So the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee met yesterday. They meet every other Thursday for 3 hours. And I'd say, I'm looking at the agenda here. There was a decent amount of time spent on summer work planning, I guess similar to what we've been doing, kind of mapping out the bulk of the work that needs to happen over the next couple of months here. There was also a presentation by the folks at Stockholm Environmental Institute regarding the business as usual assumptions. So sounds kind of similar to maybe the presentation Jay just described. I don't know that it was the same one, Jane, but
Yeah, and then let's see, there was the non-energy presentation by the task leads, and then the transportation presentation, really kind of a high level overview, just really starting to flush things out and think about those issues. So it was a pretty healthy discussion around EV adoption, projections, you know, and the number of EVs that we're going to need by 2025, by 2030, and how to sort of, you know, help us get there. I would say that is probably, yeah, it's probably enough for this group, unless Jane, you feel we should dive a little deeper on any of those main issues from the agenda yesterday.
No, that's great, Chad. At their next meeting in 2 weeks, if folks are interested, there'll be the similar presentations for buildings and thermal, as well as energy electricity. And so it's the first cut at the strategies that'll then be packaged up for the full council to consider and be vetted with the public starting over the summer, first at the end of July for the council meeting, and then in August and September.
Yep.
Are there any other member updates, Chris?
I just want to add, I watched it too, and the one thing that I noted that Chad, that they, you know, electrification in of itself of our fleet is not going to get us there, and there was a good discussion around land use components and smart growth and how that's going to help us over the long term make the state more sustainable and resilient and reduce electrical load. So just wanted to add that bit.
Yeah, great point, Chris. There was definitely a decent amount of discussion around smart growth principles and just hybrid work, like trying to get better at people telecommuting, just fewer people driving all over the roads of Vermont, shorter distances if they have to drive.
Okay. Are there any other member updates?
Would you like me to get a steering committee meeting update?
Yes, please.
The-
Because I just am realizing that was this week, not last
feels like
week.
years ago.
Thank you.
Yeah. So there was a steering committee meeting of the Vermont Climate Council on Monday, and this served as the monthly meeting where we convene the co-chairs of the 5 subcommittees to come together and speak to the sort of the work plan ahead, the crossover and touch points between the subcommittees. So it was mostly a reflection of the development of the strategies for the end of July, and if any challenges were foreseen and sticking with that timeline. There was a deeper dive given to the Just Transitions subcommittee, which now hopefully you've all seen, has produced a draft, has a substantive draft guiding principles document, which also includes definitions as well as assessment questions, and then ultimately also a scoring rubric to consider. And then that memo also, which went out to all of you, included an invitation to join a training on that work on those documents next Thursday night in lieu of their current regularly scheduled meetings. So it'll be from 4 to 5:30. I also believe I sent you all an invitation in an Outlook form, a calendar invite. So we are encouraging subcommittee members and council members to join. If you cannot be there during that time period, it'll be recorded, and we encourage folks to look at it and really then spend your own subcommittee meeting reflecting on a little bit about the challenges of application of those documents and considerations for the Just Transitions Committee to receive input on those documents, as well as the council ultimately, and how we use those tools in prioritizing strategies and recommendations that come out of subcommittees. So besides that, there wasn't any other big updates at the steering committee meeting. Everything else, yeah, that was largely what we focused on. So things feel on track there. And yeah, I'll answer any questions if there are any. And yes, pertaining to Ian's question, that'll be a publicly warned meeting that we encourage the public to attend and join in on, and there will be a period for public comment.
Thanks, Jane. The other thing, do we want to go over the potential impacts of lifting the state of emergency and our public meeting obligations?
Yes. So I just notified the co-chairs earlier today because it was brought to my attention by a council member, not our attorney or anybody else, but as our state of emergency gets lifted likely on Tuesday of next week, what that means for the open meeting law is that we have to have a physical location for every one of these meetings and they have to be staffed. And so the subcommittees, the climate council, the steering committee, all of that will have to have in-person meeting options and staffed by either a staff member or a subcommittee member or council member. So Marion's here, so she doesn't know that I've already tasked her with something, but myself and Marion will cover the Vermont Climate Council itself, the steering committee, and Marion will staff you all, which is great. And then I see a thumbs up. That's great. And then I asked the other subcommittee co-chairs to consider their capacity to staff their meetings, and I scheduled rooms within A&R for within the Agency of Natural Resources to host those meetings. Luckily, I didn't actually know this, but the restriction on the public entering this National Life Building, which used to be so challenging, is no longer there. The public can come and go, just checking in at the front desk. And so that's good. And all the Catamount room has been reserved for all of these meetings, which has a screen, a big flat screen TV, as well as a video conferencing phone. And ultimately will also be staffed with now, apparently the agency has invested in cameras that will move with the person speaking. So those won't be on board quite yet, but we don't really expect subcommittee members. You don't have to have a quorum physically present. The quorum counts via these Zoom meetings. So I expect the meetings to actually really continue like this, except for one person will be sitting in an A&R room in case any of you have a bad internet connection and want to join in person, or if a member of the public prefers to join at a physical location. So that we can't actually post the locations of the rooms until the state of emergency is lifted. So it's going to be short notice for the public next week, finding out the locations, but going forward, there'll be a set meeting room for all these meetings.
Thanks, Jane.
And
And then
makes me think, sorry, it makes me think maybe someday it might not hurt if we did do one meeting in person for everyone to get to meet each other. That's just a thought.
maybe maybe the time to do that will be when we are having some more more detailed deliberation about our recommendations, and we need to do some visuals or whatever, and we can also use the EOC for that, Jane, in Waterbury, because it's a big room and it's conducive to that workspace. The other thing is on my list is our calendar. So Catherine and I are both on leave next Friday. No, wait, sorry, on the 25th. And so we're going to make an adjustment to the work plan and our calendar. We are going to meet next Friday. So we're going to move up our, but I've got to take a look at it and make sure that we're not overtasking some of these, because it's a shortened time period in between, now and next week. So I got to take a look at that. But we'll send out an updated work plan once I have a chance to talk with her. And then we'll adjust the follow-on dates accordingly. So apologies for that. We thought we were going to get around it, but I'm actually on leave the following 2 Fridays. She's not, just on the 25th. As we're coming out of COVID and not having to focus so much on the EOC and managing everything, we've been encouraged to take some leave. So some of us are trying to do that. Anyway, any other member updates?
For what it's worth, Erica, I'm out next Friday, so I'll just, I'll check the agenda, but if you need anything from me, I will not be available.
Okay.
I'm out as well. I haven't had a vacation since I can't remember, so I'm getting one.
I'll be gone next week too.
Yeah,
All right.
already in my vacation spot, but just not on vacation yet.
Maybe we should take advantage of all these absences next Friday.
I know. Okay, let me see. All right, let me see. That's a lot of, that's a lot of, we would be, I think we'd be pressed for quorum. So let me talk with Catherine and see. We also don't want to mess up, like some of these tasks that our folks are going to be presenting on take a lot of time in deliberate. So I don't want, we move something up, I don't want to crush anybody's work time. So, all right, we'll figure that out. Cool. So are we ready? Can we go into our presentation from the Policy and Program Inventory Task Group? Take it away, Joe and team.
Okay, thanks everybody. I'm gonna share my screen. Can you all see this? Can you see this yet? This rather large table. Okay, so I'm going to start with this, but not go into any kind of detail. This is actually the inventory, and I just wanted to show you that it does in fact exist before I kind of go into a higher level review of it. But there's 117 actions on or activities on here that we've developed, and it's set up so that there's descriptive information of the activity as well as kind of an assessment of performance. And so I'll be talking about that a little bit, but I think this is something that can be posted on the website just so we can start sharing it more widely and getting feedback and input from people. So, but just to kind of take this up to a higher level. So can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, so those of us that worked on this include Mike Burke, myself, Stephanie Smith, and Marianne Woltz. And the two tasks that we're asked to report on today from the work program are right here, which is to inventory, and it's an inventory and analysis of current plans, programs, and policies, and assessing whether the items support GHG reductions, sort of as a co-benefit of adaptation and resilience, and whether inequities are specifically addressed by these activities. And then the second task is to identify where gaps exist to better integrate items to support GHG emissions reduction and building resilience. And I think, those are really two things. And the inventory is really focusing mostly on resilience and adaptation, and then looking at where the overlap is with GHG reduction kind of as a secondary item. So I'm going to just kind of go through some of the high level things here. The types of activities that we've documented. These are like, they could be planning, policy, data, program, project operations. And I would group those even into sort of the preparation part of it, which might be planning, policy, and data to kind of support decision making and the development of these different activities. And then the other part of it is sort of the implementation part, which would be programs, that are providing funding or, specific projects or operations. And, to consolidate those two things, about 20% of the activities are related to the preparation side of and developing resilience and adaptation activities. And then the rest, 80% is on the implementation side, which overall seems like a pretty good balance, right? If you think, 20% is getting ready and then 80% is actually doing something. And that's just simply a count of the activities. Of course, maybe if we had budgets for everything, you could sort of look at it that way as well. But it seems like a pretty reasonable mix, thinking about it from this perspective. And then the types of organizations that are involved, at least that we've been able to document, and the specific ones are listed below, down here. Sorry for all the acronyms, but I suspect most people on the call kind of know them. There's quite a few participants, but the state definitely has the largest role in leading the number of resilience activities, which maybe isn't so surprising. And as I was kind of looking through this and kind of trying to identify some major themes, we really, with the exception of the work that Mike has done, reaching out, of course, to the utilities and to telecommunications, which are private sector, businesses for the most part. It's we don't really know what's going on in the business community or the private sector community for resilience. That small businesses, big businesses like Global Foundries or take your pick. We don't really know what they're doing for resilience and how they're adapting, and that would probably be a good thing to get a handle on. And one thing I'll say is that this is like a gap analysis, and there's almost like a meta gap analysis in terms of our ability to do the inventory itself. It's like we're missing, and it's hard to get a handle on some of this type of information. If that's really important, and to understand what's happening in the private sector and with businesses, maybe we would want to do some kind of survey to see, what businesses are doing in Vermont to adapt. There's some obvious ones like the ski industry, but I'm not sure who else out there is doing what. And then, the question is there additional assistance they need or coordination? The types of threats that are addressed, the list is from the Global Warming Solutions Act, and we have our next task, I think, is to actually develop, look at the list and are there more threats and hazards we need to add to the list. But not surprising, extreme weather events is the biggest single threat that we've identified, and there's a really good reason for that, and it's because it's what's happening now. It's what we can all see, and it's what we're all used to reacting to, and it happens in such a way that it creates disasters, these big events that we respond to really quickly, and so it's very much on our minds. And we've done lots of work in the last 10 years since Irene hit to develop resilience, at least at the state level, to flooding. Not that there isn't more that we could do. The other sort of big category is programs that identify multiple threats. And I went through those again and tried to see if I could sort of pinpoint, is there really kind of predominant threat that they're developing, but extreme weather is still a big part of that list. But 20 of those, or about 1/3 of those activities came out of the Forest Parks and Recreation, and where lots of their activities are, it's not just about extreme weather, it's dealing with the other threats like, vector-borne diseases or maybe like invasive species, things like that, and ag and agriculture and so on, and wildlife movement, all those sorts of things, some species, preserving species, and so on. And so, since they're such a big land-based kind of organization, they really cover all sorts of things. And the overall mix of threats that we have here and sort of, how well we're doing, I think it needs to be evaluated on what the risks are that are being posed. Again, we're focusing on extreme weather events because, that's immediately in front of us. Risk is consequence and frequency or probability. And we know that bad weather is going to happen and that flooding is going to happen. And so the probability is, 100% really. And we've seen the consequences. So we're focusing our efforts on there. But we probably need to have a better handle on what the risks are that are posed by the other threats. And then you can kind of look at this list again and say, well, is this about right? Are we putting our emphasis in the right areas? I think that's sort of the fundamental question here. So again, this is sort of a gap with the inventory itself, is we may need to take another run at this when we do a better job of, or complete the job, I should say, of identifying what the risks are or what the threats are that are out there. The sectors that are addressed by these activities, I would say that we're doing a pretty good job in the natural environment overall, and the built environment overall, transportation, electricity, not too bad. In communications, there's discrete things that are happening out there in ecosystems. But maybe where we're lacking is activities that are focused on people. Although you could probably make the argument that certainly the built environment has a direct impact on people's lives, and electricity and communication as well. So, why do we care about those things? We care about them because they matter to people at the end of the day. But I'm thinking maybe there's some health impacts that we don't have well documented yet. And maybe there's some other things there. Again, we haven't identified activities specific to businesses or jobs. And I'm waiting for more information on housing. I have spoken to Jen Holler at Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, and she's pulling information together, and she just is away. She's had a busy season, just like everybody else. But once we get that, we'll add that in. And that's critically important when you start thinking about impacts to people, is housing. So we'll get that and include that in the results. One of the things that we did, and just thinking about these activities, is what are their benefits and purposes in general? And it's tied to the definitions of adaptation and resilience that are in the Global Warming Solutions Act. And really these three sort of factors down here are directly related to the definition of adaptation, which is reducing vulnerabilities, and then resilience, which is improving the ability to withstand and improving the ability to recover. And I think that there's the high level observation does a pretty good job of sort of checking these boxes, these different activities and how they're helping us to adapt and become more resilient. And then a couple other categories were added, which is reducing greenhouse gases, and forest parks and recreation added the benefit of carbon sequestration and storage, which others probably might have a different perspective, but these I sort of feel like kind of go hand in hand, because if carbon sequestration is working, then that helps reduce greenhouse gases that are going into the atmosphere as well. So again, this gets back to that question of sort of tying resilience and adaptation to reduction of greenhouse gases. So, I mean, overall, that looks pretty good. Like, the activities that are out there are sort of on target in terms of what it is they're trying to achieve. So to try to sum this up, the first question about assessing whether items support GHG reduction, about 1/3 of the activities do that. That's part of kind of their purpose. So I think that's a positive observation that we can make. One really big challenge we have with this inventory is, again, there's like 117 or so activities on the list, and in trying to assess whether or not inequities are being specifically addressed by each one of those programs it's really hard to figure out how we're going to do this at working kind of at this level, which is just trying to get our hands around, what's actually happening and out there with resilience and adaptation. And we've looked through a little bit of the just transitions methodology for of how to do that, and really it would take quite a bit of time, because each one of these activities are detailed. There's they're complicated. There's a lot going on with them, and to really assess each one will take an amount of time. So we're thinking there could be just a gut check screening on these, like is there what's the potential inequity? Is it low, medium, high? That would be sort of a guess. It could be refined a little bit to some of the guiding principles that are in the Just Transition Act. That would really complicate it, and so I guess I appreciate some direction from the full subcommittee on how we should how we can address that. And then in terms of just the overall gaps and what we're seeing in the inventory right now, so there's limited activities that address threats posed by drought, less uncertain snowfall, and less uncertain snowfall and, well, I had that wrong. I'm sorry, uncertain. You guys remember what those last three are? There were three. I'll have to look back at that. But and then also just the adaptation needs of businesses, the adaptation needs of people might be lacking. And potentially there's a lack of coordination between all these activities. You know, it just occurs to me that a lot of these are happening sort of organically, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So resilience and adaptation happens naturally when conditions change. You know, in order to survive, you need to adapt, right? So it's just sort of, you know, happening because it needs to happen. And that's why I think, again, broken record, but on the business side, for businesses to survive, they have to adapt as well. So if they're really being impacted by climate change, they're making the changes that they need to make. So when it comes to looking at the specific activities that are out there, and you know, we asked the people that are running those programs what they thought the limitations would be, and I tried to look at some themes that I saw popping out, and one of them is limited scope or eligibility. So it might be a really good idea, but it could be expanded. And you know, a couple examples of that might be, you know, in my case, at the Agency of Transportation, we've developed the ability to evaluate the vulnerability of culverts, bridges, and road segments throughout the whole state and to flood damage, and which didn't previously exist before Irene. And so we have a really good handle on the highway system, but what we don't have a good handle on is, you know, the rail system, for example, and some of our other modes, you know, transit as well as walking and biking. And so we could expand the methodology to include those modes. We just haven't got there yet. Another example would be the Downtown Transportation Fund, you know, which Chris runs and the Agency of Transportation funds. And as the name implies, it was originally focused just on designated downtowns. And this year, there's a one-time funding to include village centers. I think that's the extent of it, but it's only like a year, and maybe that will run a couple of years. I don't know, but that's an example of, you know, Chris was talking about the importance of smart growth to support resilience. And on the transportation side, just networks inside of smart growth areas really do improve the resilience of the transportation system. So, you know, that's a program that would be great to expand and maybe on a permanent basis. Buyout program is another one where it would be great to expand the eligibility of it. Inconsistencies across the state, and you know, one of the main examples of that is the municipal flood hazard bylaws. You know, and so that's really about keeping new development out of the river corridor and flood hazard areas. And there's incentives to do that, but there's still, you know, 150 municipalities that haven't done it yet. And you know, probably the reasons that some of these great ideas haven't expanded is because sometimes they're voluntary, so they're not required. Often, and we've already, you know, this has come up many times, and you know, I've heard Jens talk about it. He works a lot with local folks. Is just the lack of capacity at the local level, both in terms of, you know, voluntary driven boards and small staffs and just limited budgets, and just being overwhelmed with everything and not being able to kind of handle all this other stuff that we think is great at the state level, but they, you know, they just can't deal with it so much at the local level. And insufficient and or lack of dedicated funding source, you know, that's often, of course, raised, but it's come up quite often in the comments that people provided on their limitation. Often some of the resilience and adaptation activities are reactive. And it's hard to be proactive, right? Because are you going to make an investment on something where there's some uncertainty? You know, you're not really sure the change is going to happen. So maybe it does make sense that being resilient and adaptive happen after you have a better understanding of what that really looks like. But I saw that as a theme. And then just lack of data to help support, you know, good decision making. So that's it. It's kind of a lot of information to throw at you, but we're trying to figure out, like, where do we go from here? I think a big challenge is that how do we evaluate inequities and maybe just fill in some additional information. And then are we in a spot here where this can help at least inform the strategy development that is one of the next and probably the most important step that this group has to do.
Thanks so much, Joe. That was really good. Why don't we open it up for discussion and questions?
And does the team have any other thing to add? Mike, Marianne, and Stephanie, sorry about that.
I had some examples as you were going through it, but I don't think it really adds to anything that you didn't hit. Nice job, Joe. Thank you.
And Joe, I'm also chasing Jen Holler. She just got back in town today, and I can help you fill in some of the gaps in the housing stuff too.
That's great. Thank you.
Actually, to that point, I do still have some other things out there with at least the private sector utilities that even today, Ann and I kind of stumbled on some programs that the communication companies have for resilience that we didn't capture. So I think we'll continue to add some things here and there.
Yeah, I think Joe did a great job capturing, I think, where we noted gaps. And one thing, as a lot of those programs were listed for state agencies, I think we've realized that there certainly is a lot happening in the private sector. We just perhaps didn't have the opportunity to include it in the inventory. And I'll give a quick example. I touched base with someone from VEIC last week, and she recommended I talk to Dan Riley at Efficiency Vermont about a number of programs that they're doing. And I think some of that would perhaps cover the housing with weatherization programs and other things like that. So there's certainly, I think, room for this inventory to grow, but we've captured quite a bit.
So I guess oops, sorry, go ahead.
Just for those of us who may have been negligent in the past, what's the easiest way to add programs to that inventory at this point, given how much work you've already done?
You can I'll send you the spreadsheet, Jens, and you can just add to it. And I did get a bunch of information from, I'm forgetting her name now, but from Forest Parks and Recreation, but you're from
Valley, Katiba.
Yeah, but you're from Fish and Wildlife. Sorry, sometimes I forget. Like sometimes I get confused in my A&R departments.
No worries, they're all green vests.
Yeah. Yeah, so it would be great to get some of the work that you've been doing. I think that's really important, and so we're missing that as well.
Jane has her hand up, and then Chad.
I just wanted to speak to the equity assessment component. So we're thinking a lot about this because there's a lot of reasons multiple reasons why I'm thinking about it. One, capacity to apply it across the subcommittees, and two, perhaps inconsistency in how it would be applied. When you read the document, it is actually it's one thing to read it and agree to it, but there's another thing with the respect to the scoring rubric in particular, and how it creates the appearance of something that's subjective and personal, perhaps, to how somebody may apply it or use a screening tool, and create it an objectivity component of it by giving it a number. And so one of the things that we talked about at the council meeting last time is our commitment to equity and inclusion sort of as a three-pronged approach. One being the way we engage with the public, two, holding space at our council meetings to have a training or reflection or commitment to learning together around this space of work, and then three, around organizational review. So thinking about how the subcommittees and council are organized to reflect our interest in being reflective and learning in the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That proposal around what that word could look like has come back in from a consultant, and it's a huge body of work wondering about like where capacity is to actually do that. And so you guys can probably hear my twin boys, like they're like screaming and wrestling behind me.
Oh, really?
No. Okay. I'm like, but I've been thinking a lot about if we were going to use our funding for something, like other states have focused this work on hiring a team of people who have expertise to apply these tools consistently across the subcommittees. And that's where my head is going. And I've been talking to the Just Transitions co-chairs, and I hope that we can roll out that idea more next week at the training. So I just want to, I hear you, and everybody is saying, we don't have capacity to do this, nor do we have the expertise to do this with our strategies and recommendations. So.
Go
ahead, Sean.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go out on a little bit of a limb here and say, and maybe, well, I should just speak for the programs I'm familiar with. And I think it's accurate to say that, none of them are intentionally inequitable. And so, but that doesn't mean that we've done a good job in considering whether or not they are that way or not, right? And so, like Mike and I were talking about this, like this, when we make decisions on where to put a culvert, is that, inequitable? Well, it could be, could be that if we replace a culvert in a spot that, is disproportionately impacts, a marginalized community, or we fix one before another, right? And so it is possible. But I think I see it more as like something that goes on. This is work that's got to happen. And we're about ready to kick off a big study, and it was required in the transportation bill, I think, of looking at how equity fits into all of our decision-making processes at the Agency of Transportation and the work that we do with the regional planning commissions, because we just need to be able to understand that and then build it into our decision-making processes. So for us, it's just not really formalized there yet. And I suspect that's probably the case for most of the existing programs and activities that we've identified on the list. So why not just own that right now and say that and not try to beat ourselves over the head trying to evaluate the equity of everything that's been done in the past, because we know there's room for improvement. And that becomes a strategy potentially that's recommended in that climate action plan itself.
Yeah, I was just, I would love to be copied on that email as well, Joe. And I guess just gets to a question that I have with respect to where we house all of these sort of shared documents. I mean, when I have a free minute, I kind of try to, look at some of this stuff. And do we post it to the website, or what can we do to sort of, obviously we've got to be careful because these aren't final forms yet, but I'm just wondering how we can share these tools, these documents most effectively.
The materials are posted to the Climate Council website under subcommittee stuff. I find it's a little hard to find stuff because it's in a running list sequentially, like chronologically from when the subcommittees meet. That was actually a piece of feedback I had, which is if we can organize them on the website under the subcommittee itself and not in a running list of the meetings, that would be helpful because then folks can reference the updated versions.
Yeah, I
Joe,
know. It's such a challenge.
This inventory list is on there too?
It is.
Is on.
Yeah, everything that gets circulated with the email for your meetings has to get posted as per open meeting law. So it's all up there. But as Erica alludes to, it's there for open meeting law. It's not there for sharing per se. It's, and that's where the challenge of open meeting law comes. You cannot, if you're meeting as a non-quorum, you can work and create documents and then share them with the subcommittee as a whole to comment on, but you can't do like Google Share Docs or anything like that through open meeting law, which is, so they're all there. But the next phase of the engagement component of our contract around engagement and outreach is a new website. And so we're starting to think about what that website would look like in the building of it. And it certainly thinking about how the documents will look like on there too. So yeah, it could be better. And there's probably a better process, like when the document's final. Like somebody said to me, I can only see the RFP as you were like talking about for the technical analysis as draft, but I can't find the final RFP that went out for technical analysis because it never went back to the subcommittee. So it never got posted to the website. So there's just working drafts up there, but not the final one. And it's just a matter of how the process works in capacity right now. Sorry.
Okay.
Dana,
all right, thanks. That's helpful.
Would we be able to set up a SharePoint site, even if we weren't going to collaborate on the documents, but just as a repository?
Yes, we have a SharePoint site, and that's part of the advantage of all having a partner email. You can use that site with your partner email. So I'll drop that in here. You have to have a state email account to access it, but I'll drop it in the chat. And that is a great, there's a Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee folder there, and you can use that as a repository for documents.
Oh,
Just can't edit them.
I can't edit them.
What?
So
Yeah, just can't edit them.
so you can so you could at least see the most recent version in one spot. But if you wanted to edit it, you would have to go to the author, request like a copy to edit it. Okay. Well, we will use that. And then what, yeah, so we'll, all right, make a note of that. Chris?
Just a quick question for Joe. When are you thinking you're going to get to actually like implementation strategies? Did you mention that, or did I miss that? Or
That's one of the work program tasks. And I just see this as kind of feeding into that, but that's not something our group will do itself. Although is that required?
Well, it is. So the task, the final task is developing recommendations, policies, legislation, programs, or operations to resolve identified gaps. So they've done the gap analysis. We see the gaps that exist based on their analysis, and it would then be the final task to present some recommendations to resolve those or to address them in some way. So, but those also this is where the inventory and the other batch of work related to the climate action plan recommendations, there's potentially some overlap. So what we would see is the initial recommendations from the policy and program inventory task group will likely be like, they could be standalone and could stay all the way through, or they may feed and evolve into some of the other task groups. Because I mean, we have a really good foundation here where we have a gap analysis where we can see that these are all of the programs and policies that are available that even touch on this. And here's where the gaps are. And we need to think strategically about how do we want to fulfill those gaps and what recommendations do we have related to that.
Yeah, I feel like, we have a small working group, and I think when it comes to coming up with solutions, I think it should really be, folded into the task that's going to do that, so that we just don't have the four of us kind of brainstorming what the ideas are. Yeah, and that might be self-serving a little bit too, but I just, there's just so much that, we all have our area of expertise, I guess, but it's not all encompassing of everything that's on that list.
I mean, that's a really good point, Joe, that, I mean, even if you came up with like some initial thoughts or something that wasn't fully baked, that was able to feed into the rest of the task groups that are doing the climate action plan recommendations, it's something for them to work with. They've got this PowerPoint presentation, they've got a good reference, because this was really meant to feed the rest of the recommendations, and this is really solid work.
Right, and I think that our work program as the Rural Resilience Subcommittee and whatever task it is, where we all come up with strategies of the universe of strategies that we're going to work on. I think sort of the gap analysis points to some things, and we also talked about last week about this idea of, the strategies are sort of the buckets of ideas, and then, under that are the more specific actions. And so I think some of the gaps we've identified maybe are those strategies, or, maybe not all of them, and I just would like to have that discussion with the whole group rather than just the four of us.
Okay. Chad, did you have a question? Okay. Getting back to the how we apply the just transitions guiding principles and the equity focus on at the program and policy level. I don't think the guiding principles and the evaluation rubric that they've come up with are really meant to be applied at this inventory level.
Right.
I think what we wanted to do was just at least get a general feeling on which of the programs have obvious equity issues or maybe don't specifically address equity in their regulation. It's really just to get a feel for where are the inequities baked in or inherent or kind of playing out in some of the programs and policies that exist to address climate change in Vermont, and and then from that, how can we address those? But it's hard to do that without, what I'm saying is not a very scientific way to do that. So
No, and it's who is going to make that determination?
Right.
You know, when you look at this description we have on this spreadsheet of a
Right.
program, who's going to say, oh, that might be inequitable?
Right. And then what is the criteria for that?
Yeah. And that's why I was kind of suggesting this more global acceptance of right now, we don't know. and maybe this is an action that comes out of the climate action plan, is to do a deeper dive on equity in all of the existing programs.
Mm.
I know that sounds like we're punting it a little bit, but well, it is, because we are punting it. But that's just where we are right now.
Okay. I understand that for sure. Okay, we're over on our time for this topic, but what is the general feeling of the group? Joe, do you feel like you have some feedback enough to be able to move on to task 4, which was develop a list of threats and hazards and impacts to overall climate change resilience, and then rank in terms of impact and probability?
Yeah, I think, that's almost standalone, even though we'll feed back into this. I would say this is iterative, and, so I'll get, send a spreadsheet specifically to Jens and Chad and Chris. And then if you guys want to add anything to the list, that'll be great. We'll just we'll add that to the list, because it's just a draft at the moment. And so let's get that done. And same thing, once we redo the threats, we'll have to kind of look at the inventory as it relates to the new list of threats. And are we missing, are there activities that are addressing any new threats that we identify or not? I think that's kind of the key question.
Yeah, that definitely feeds the gap analysis.
And then maybe we just call the inventory task done at that point and move on.
Well, and provide it as a reference for folks
Right.
to use as they're developing the recommendations.
Yeah, and I think as part of the outreach in the climate action plan, I'm still not sure how that all actually works, but certainly can present the inventory as information that's out there and open for additional comments. If we miss something, please let us know.
That's a good idea.
Joe, I also think it's useful to note that the inventory is going to be out of date the second we even say it's done,
Right.
because it is a constantly shifting human landscape, and all of our organizations are constantly adapting and trying out new programs.
Yeah.
Just in the world of conservation, our regional conservation initiatives kind of come and go, and the more citizen-led stuff has about a 3 to 5 year lifespan.
Right. Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent point.
Okay, I think we are able to move on from
Yep.
this topic. Thank you to everybody that worked on that. I'm really impressed by that. So thank you very much.
Welcome.
Okay, so Matt, you're up to talk about critical infrastructure. Are you able to share your screen?
Let me see. It looks like I'm going to be able to, but I'll make sure. Let's try that. Get back to the first slide. Let me know how
Yep,
that's
we can see
looking.
it.
And you can hear me, I'm assuming, too?
Yep.
All right, that's a good combination. All righty. So good afternoon, folks. I am Matt Pritchard. I am a Homeland Security Program Planner with Vermont Emergency Management in the Homeland Security Unit. I'll just give you an overview today of the Vermont Infrastructure Protection and Resilience Plan, very much focused on the definition of critical infrastructure and a bit of what separates and constitutes kind of, local infrastructure as opposed to maybe state infrastructure, national infrastructure, et cetera. And I will do my best to get us on track with time as well. So I will hopefully bring a few benefits to it. So just reviewing again, so I'm hoping to everyone can walk away with a general understanding of how Vermont Emergency Management and Homeland Security Unit defines critical infrastructure, provide a basic understanding of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and like I said, provide that insight into kind of what separates significance at the different levels. So what is critical infrastructure? And I'm assuming part of this is that, classifying infrastructure as critical can be a difficult task. Infrastructure can be very broad. It can be a very narrow scope. And part of that's due because there is locally significant infrastructure. Think the mom and pop shops within a local municipality that contributes to the economy. There's state level. There's regionally when it comes to New England and the Northeast. And there's also nationally significant infrastructure. And at each of those levels, there's a certain level of criticality that comes to each infrastructure site. And, one of the things I hope to shed light on is kind of how that differentiates and provide that. But across all of these sectors, I think most of them will use this definition of critical infrastructure. And this definition is the definition we use within the Vermont Infrastructure Protection and Resilience Plan, as well as the definition that the Department of Homeland Security uses kind of across jurisdictions. And I'm going to start by reading it verbatim for everyone's sake, and then we'll hone in on just a couple of components. So the definition is those public and private sector systems and assets, whether physical or virtual, that are so vital their incapacity or destruction would have a debilitating effect on the security, economy, public health or safety, environment, or any combination of those across all levels of government and jurisdictions. And the four things that I want to hone in on in this definition and why this can be used kind of across different levels is the four kind of lines of security, economy, public health or safety, and environment. And to look at this definition is to look at those as the four consequence factors when it comes to establishing criticality. So as a site becomes more critical, the consequences associated with those four factors are also going to increase. And I'm going to get into a little bit more detail of what that means and what that looks like, but I'm going to throw that out as the blanket statement for now. So when we talk about critical infrastructure within the plan, we are focused on 16 critical infrastructure sectors. And I have 12 listed here to start that range from everything from dams to the chemical sector, government facilities, healthcare, and so on and so forth. But there's four in particular that I wanted to take a moment to call out and just kind of hone in on. And these four sectors are in orange, and it's transportation, communications, energy, and our water sectors. These four sectors are what we consider lifeline sectors. And what we mean by lifeline sectors is that basically all of the other sectors listed here are dependent or interdependent on these four sectors. So for example, let's take the financial sector as an example. It's reliant on the energy sector to power their businesses and keep the lights on, the communications infrastructure to carry out their day-to-day functions, water to have in their facility, transportation to move cash and things like that, things of that nature. So it's important to note and call out those four as lifelines because they are interconnected with every other sector. So, take it with a grain of salt as maybe when you're focusing on 16 critical infrastructure sectors, these four can stand out as lifeline sectors and are relatively significant. So turning the page, now that we kind of have the definition out there and the 16 sectors, and focusing in on kind of what constitutes state level infrastructure. So since early 2020, I've been working on identifying state level significant infrastructure across all sectors. And basically what I'm working on and what I've done is my predecessors on this project and program have worked with subject matter experts across all of the 16 sectors. I think there's maybe a few of you here that have worked on contributing to that, to come up with a particular criteria threshold for each sector. And what I mean by that, and I'm going to use critical manufacturing because it's a relatively easy example, is that threshold may be, businesses that employ X number of people or have a revenue of X. And all those thresholds are based off of, again, those 4 factors in the critical infrastructure definition. So security, economy, public health or safety, and environment. So when we're looking at that example of businesses that employ X number of people or have a revenue of X, the subject matter experts have worked with our team to come up and fill in those X's as to what's relevant at the state level. And, within this example in critical manufacturing, we're looking very closely at that economic impact. So at what point is it kind of catastrophic or debilitative that that business and that site is going to have a large impact on the greater state scale? And just to illustrate that and continue with the example of critical manufacturing as to separate kind of, local, state, and national. And this is, I will say, this is just an example. They're phony numbers a bit. It's just to illustrate kind of the effect of what we're looking at. So I have 3 companies here, and company A employs 5 people and has $500,000 in revenue in the all in the critical manufacturing sector. That site and that company is probably relatively locally significant and employs a few people, has a $500,000 revenue, maybe people shop there, et cetera, et cetera. On a state scale or a national scale, maybe it's not quite to that threshold. But as we move into company B and we see that it's employing 450 people with $50 million in revenue, that probably becomes a little bit more potentially significant to the state. It's a bit of a larger scale, it's employing more people, and it's a little bit more significant. And then moving on to company C, 2,500 people at $250 million in revenue, maybe that's a bit more of a national level significance. If that company, something happens to that company, goes out of business, whatever it may be, it's probably going to be on the national news channel that night. So that's just kind of breaking down in that. And on the next slide, we'll look at an example of what this kind of looks like on a small scale through a few of the different sectors. So starting at the top with healthcare, when we talk about local and state significance, local, is your local doctor's office. Whereas, on the state scale, we're probably more so focusing on those regional hospitals where more people can be taken in, more services can be provided, et cetera. With dams is a bit of a weird one because you could have small dams in a community that certainly have a significant impact on the larger scale, but maybe those small dams are more locally significant as opposed to those larger dams that could provide catastrophic consequences should something happen to them. And then in the next 3, it's really just the difference in size when it comes to maybe food and ag, commercial facilities, and energy, just as examples. A small farm stand might be very significant to the local economy, the local food sources, but a large farm operation that's distributing nationwide, out of state, throughout the state, maybe even internationally, is much more significant, and that criticality is much higher. Same goes for commercial facilities, kind of, the more businesses and the more people you're packing into a building, certainly the more critical and significant that building is going to become. And then in energy, just as an example, small power generation facilities are definitely important to the local municipalities. But as that criteria goes and you're looking at, what sites are powering larger areas and larger square miles and larger households, that's certainly going to increase that criticality criteria. So that's the short and easy, breezy kind of rough go at providing the definition of critical infrastructure, what we use, and kind of that baseline look at how we're doing. But again, just to wrap up and hopefully get us back on track with timing, those 4 factors are so critical when defining critical infrastructure: security, economy, public health or safety, and environment. And again, as each of those increases, in security, it might be injury or death. Economy, there's the monetary value. Public health or safety, and then the environment. As everything in that increases, the criticality of sites is going to go up. And that's kind of what moves it across those jurisdictions from locally significant to state, regional, so on and so forth. So that's, that's, I think, the big takeaway is to think about the definition, think about those 4 factors when considering critical infrastructure, and just thinking about the 16 sectors and those 4 lifeline sectors that, all other sectors are dependent on things within those 4 sectors. And again, that's energy, water, transportation, and communications. And the last bullet kind of just wraps up the top. But again, that's the quick dive. That's the definition we use. That's kind of how we're looking at it in different criteria thresholds. And that's my information if anyone has any questions after. But I will certainly, I suppose I'm around. I'll be here for questions and discussion, but I will turn it back to the director to lead us through that.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. And the primary reason I asked Matt to be here and to go over this is because in our charge, and as one of the deliverables from the GWSA, in our CAP recommendations, we need to have recommendations for fortifying critical transportation, electricity, and community infrastructure. That is like so broad, especially when you talk about community infrastructure. And I thought it would help us frame what we have to do to make recommendations under the lens of climate change and incidents that climate change exacerbates the impacts of, is to think about this in terms of the definition of critical infrastructure. And that I figured that would help us frame how we're developing those recommendations. And especially because everybody has a different definition of critical infrastructure. The definition that exists that Matt just presented to you covers all of those different levels. And it really puts, I think, some objectivity into how you view what is or isn't critical infrastructure, depending on the level of scale you're at. Is there any questions or comments for Matt? We'll go with Jens and we'll go with Anne.
Well, this is a broad question, but I'm interested in the treatment of green infrastructure and thinking about the natural world as infrastructure, green infrastructure that's critically important. In some ways, like in the stormwater system, if we get to an engineered solution, it means that we haven't spent enough time with the green infrastructure first. And so in that regard, the engineering is sort of a failure to have done our work with green infrastructure first. So as a committee, as I think about us addressing rural resilience, I'm wondering if it makes sense to include some green infrastructure in that definition, so that we're not just using nature-based strategies to fix other infrastructure, we're actually using nature-based strategies to maintain our green infrastructure. So it's more of a step back policy decision question than specific to Matt's presentation. I know you all are deeply immersed in the world of infrastructure, and I'm not. So I don't fully appreciate the nuances, but I know that there's a lot I don't know, and I really respect all the thought that went into that work that you've shown.
Well, likewise, I don't know all of the nuances of green infrastructure and nature-based systems, and so that's why we're all here together. I think. But I mean, you bring up a good point, because to me that seems like it's more of a proactive approach versus a reactive approach. Like when we're trying to fortify critical infrastructure, it's because it's already there and it's already having an impact, and it may actually be having a negative impact on some of our green infrastructure or in nature-based solutions that we could be talking about. So what do folks think about that? That's a good question that Jens poses.
Well, one of the factors is environment.
Joe, could you repeat that?
I said, well, one of the 4 factors is the environment. And so it seems like there's some justification for that. If I understand the way you're kind of suggesting it, it's like critical infrastructure is something that's important to one or more of those 4 factors.
I think it's important to, in the objective here, we have to develop best practice recommendations specific to rural communities for reducing municipal and school district and residential fossil fuel consumption, fortifying critical transportation, electricity, and community infrastructure, expanding the use of nature-based solutions to enhance landscape resilience in the built environment, and then creating a distributed, redundant, storage supported electrical system. So does that, do we feel like what we're talking about is really, we have the recommendations that will be focused towards some critical infrastructure. And I think, Jens, what you're saying is that some of our recommendations will need to be focused towards that green infrastructure as well in that lump of critical infrastructure recommendations. And it's not relevant to the next piece of that, which is expanding the use of nature-based solutions, which is the second piece of that. Okay.
Yeah, it's just trying to be more proactive by calling it a critical infrastructure.
So what do folks think about that? We're probably not going to be changing our definition of critical infrastructure in the infrastructure protection and resilience plan as of yet. But maybe that's something to look at as a part of, a recommendation from this group. Especially if it's important enough that it can alleviate the impacts of climate change and those incidents that are exacerbated by it.
Well, the list that you just read off from, I guess it was from the act, it says what we have to do, which includes nature-based solutions, I guess, and the other things that you listed, like transportation, which perked my ears up. So I'm trying to think, well, why are we, if the act has already said these are the things that you have to look at, why are we taking the next step of saying what critical infrastructure is if they've already kind of said what it is?
They say transportation, electrical, and community infrastructure.
Yeah.
And we've added communications infrastructure in the task.
Okay.
There's no definition of community infrastructure. So that's why, it's very broad. And so just thinking about this, I thought it would be helpful for us to understand what the definition of critical infrastructure is, because that really formulates, I think, and solidifies what we're really talking about when we talk about community, electrical, transportation, and communications infrastructure.
I feel like it's kind of already included, such as floodplain rehabilitation, things like that, that are already. I think you could lump it into what it already reads, just with the environment and nature-based solutions. I think that may cover. It's whatever we want it to be, right?
That's right. Well, it's really about what's going to feed the most comprehensive set of recommendations. So, making sure that we're not excluding an important piece of that. Ben? Oh, you're on mute.
Yes, I am. Hello, everyone. Good discussion. I first wanted to ask Jens if you have examples of green infrastructure as they would relate to what would be included in this list of critical infrastructure.
Connected forest would be one. If that network of connected forest actually breaks, the cost to society and the cost of the number of species we have, cost of biological diversity, the real shutdown of environmental services would be catastrophic.
Okay.
So like a wetland would be, a wetland complex would be another example, right?
Right.
Okay.
Okay, that's helpful. In that case, Jens, I agree, although I think the strategies for protecting wetlands and unfragmented upland habitat and so forth are different from the strategies for protecting the more traditional types of critical infrastructure. And to that point, I think there is good overlap between what's in the act that's been specified for us and defined and what Matt laid out, the 4 critical lifeline sectors. We know we have to protect our transportation infrastructure from getting flooded out. We know we have to protect our energy and communications infrastructure from going down for a month under a dark sky scenario and all the ramifications that would result from that. When I think about community infrastructure and looking back at it through the lens of Irene and other storms, the things in every community that need to be there so that people won't die are the water treatment plant, the sewage treatment plant, an SEOC location, fire station / public works that's not in the flood zone. And through an equity lens, a lot of our poorest, least resource communities are the most vulnerable when it comes to the quality and locations and resilience of those pieces of community infrastructure. Every community in Vermont should have those things in a place where they're going to function even during Irene.
Yeah, yeah, and then that's the challenge. I think there's some folks that really feel like the church is an important piece of community infrastructure, or so it can really be like the realm of what is critical and an important piece of community infrastructure can be ever expanding.
One last comment is that when I say emergency operations center, I'm thinking too of community sheltering and a warming center. I mean, we've had a multi-year battle with FEMA over whether they'll fund a generator for a community warming shelter in Brownington, Vermont. And it gets really cold up there. And if the wrong combination of things happen on the wrong week in February, things could go sideways very quickly up there because they don't have a generator in a warming shelter.
I think what's tricky about the threats from climate change is it's not just that emergency scenario, it's also the long haul of decreasing biological diversity, increasing human disease and so forth. And it's I think the natural infrastructure helps protect against some of those long haul problems and even mitigate some of the immediate damage from short-term problems like flooding. So I'm just even thinking strategically, I want to have strategies that can address that kind of infrastructure and not have to write our strategies that say, oh, to build the community, we then need to build the forest. And we could just go to, no, we actually need to address forest right off the bat.
Yeah. Makes sense, Jens. We're at time and I still need to allow some time for public comment. So Anne, I completely missed you and I'm so sorry. I forgot that when you took your hand down. Do you want to add what you wanted your comment now?
Yeah, I just put it in, I think I just put it in the comments section. Okay. So if folks want to read that, but I'll cede my time for public comments because I got to run and get my kid, but thank you.
Sorry about that, Anne. I won't miss you next time. Thanks, everybody. That was really good discussion. We'll do a couple minutes for public comment, and I think we have our first one from Ian Hitchcock.
Hello all, thanks for that discussion. Ian Hitchcock from VNRC here. I'll try to be brief. Just wanted to quickly flag, Joe, I was kind of spamming the chat during your presentation as I was thinking of resources that might be helpful that I'm aware of in terms of particularly the areas of health and business resilience. So happy to follow up with connecting to some of those reports or conversations ongoing, but I hope that might be helpful to fill some of those gaps. And I did want to speak a little bit to the recent conversation around like kind of how we define resilience and critical infrastructure and one of the real challenges I think that this group faces and we all face is the fact that like climate change necessitates a broadening and expanding of our definitions of like what is critical and who are stakeholders in ways that are really challenging for official processes. One aspect of things that I've heard come up in conversation a lot in a less kind of objective and quantifiable way has been the, a lack of social infrastructure in rural areas in Vermont. And I didn't necessarily see how that fit into the kind of emergency management and, FEMA critical infrastructure definitions that were provided. So I would encourage folks not to lose sight of that, just because from my experience in working with rural areas, like, even if you have, the existence of a bridge or a road that is secure, like, people's ability to access that, if they don't have access to jobs that pay well, for instance, could make that mean that they are less resilient than it might seem on paper. And so thinking about people's subjective needs, and I think in the climate space, how doing the sorts of things we need to do, like transitioning from fossil fuel based means of heating and transportation to electrical based ones, can help improve individual level economic resilience. I just came off of a webinar from the Energy Action Network where they were talking about all of the benefits that can come from reducing dependence on fossil fuel use, and I think those would be particularly acute in rural areas. So I think thinking about those sorts of considerations beyond the how do we respond to a direct and drastic emergency situation, and into how do we help people move out of what may be a perpetual state of financial emergency if you're working rural poor in Vermont, using some strategies that, oh, by the way, may reduce greenhouse gases as well. So just some other thoughts to add there.
Thanks, Ian. Are any other members of the public wishing to comment at this time? Okay, so just as a reminder, folks, from our work plan, the next meeting, we will be listening to presentations on task 4 under the policy and program inventory, which is the hazard list and ranking. We will also be listening to some initial drafts of under the CAP recommendations task group of tasks 2 and 3, which are related, which are transportation and electrical and communications infrastructure, as well as implementation of storage supported local electrical systems. So please reference that is that's Joe Segali, and then that's Mike Burke, Chad Farrell, and Ann Margolis that we'll be hearing from. I am not going to move that task deliverable up a week on you. We may need to look at some other meeting times, or because it appears like Fridays are getting really tough. So anyway, I'll connect with Catherine, and we'll get back to folks on that. It may also just mean that we need to give some more time right now for folks to meet on an off basis that you folks can coordinate. I don't think any of these groups represent a quorum of this subcommittee, so you're all set in terms of public meeting requirements, but you will need to meet and discuss this in the outside of the meetings for sure. If you need any help, please reach out. If you need clarification, don't hesitate. Catherine and I are available, and you should have access actually to the entire list of subcommittee members. Any questions before we depart?
Erica, the quorum is 4, right?
Now that we've added Jay Kemrick, hold on just a minute, let me pull up my list. Was 7. We had 7 total before. Now that we have Jake, we are at 8. So I think a quorum is a majority, which is 5. right? Or is it 4? Somebody might have to help me on that. Anyway, we're not close to those on either. So
Yeah, so if we
it's all
have
of ours.
2 or 3, we're fine.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other final parting comments, questions? Happy Friday. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon.